Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. As Vic said, my name is Aisha Qureshi, and I am a social science analyst at the National Institute of Justice working on the domestic radicalization and violent extremism research portfolio. Sorry, guys, I will try my best to move over because this is so rude, this monitor right here. I am also joined by my colleague, Kateira Aryaeinejad, whom you'll hear from in just a bit later today. First and foremost, I want to thank Vic for inviting me out here to share a bit about what we do and our research portfolio, and sort of our role in trying to move the field of radicalization to violent extremism studies forward, right? Vic initially, as he said, reached out to me sort of, still in peak pandemic, and there were a lot of travel restrictions in place. And I said, sorry, our agency isn't allowing for travel right now. And he was persistent and he reached back out. And I think sort of the silver lining of that was while all that time had passed, we were working with Kat on a synthesis project, and she was really kind of looking at years and years of NIJ-funded research, synthesizing it, trying to understand what are some of the key takeaways and lessons learned, and some actionable, next steps that we can take from all of this funding that NIJ is putting into this space. And so I think the opportunity was just really, really perfect in terms of timing. So thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. I know you could have been anywhere else and you chose to come and listen to us. We're based out of the DC area, so it's our first time in El Paso, and we're very grateful that you guys are hosting us and with us today, and we hope that it'll be a really great conversation. I am going to have to click twice, so there we go. Okay. So I just want to start off by saying that Kat's presentation is going to be a lot more exciting than mine. I have to go over all the boring stuff, but I think the boring stuff is kind of important to lay the foundation for everything that Kat is going to share. My presentation is going to focus on sort of providing an overview of the domestic radicalization and violent extremism research portfolio at the National Institute of Justice, which is a part of the Department of Justice. I'm also going to highlight the purpose and the goals of the program and share some key findings from some of the research, but leave that mostly to Kat, and kind of discuss the next steps that NIJ is taking to try to address some of the more nuanced challenges that are being faced by policy and practice partners. And we'll also talk a bit about how we're using the money that Congress gives us to put out solicitations and the application and review process, so you kind of understand the rigor with which we sort of scrutinize and critique our applications to make sure that we're funding the most up-to-date topics and the most rigorous research methods. So what is the National Institute of Justice? So NIJ is essentially the research arm of the DOJ, for those of you who may not know, and we're housed under the Office of Justice Programs. And NIJ's mission is to provide objective and independent knowledge and tools to inform the decision-making processes of the criminal justice community and to reduce crime and advance justice. Okay. So how does the topic of domestic radicalization and violent extremism really fall into NIJ's wheelhouse? So I'll talk a little bit about our history here and how the current program kind of came to be. So after the September 11th attacks, NIJ and the National Academies of Sciences developed a research agenda that focused on things like developing terrorism databases, right? Or improving the responses to terrorism and studying the makeup of terrorist organizations. So, their culture and their structure. And these investments kind of helped play a really vital role in the development of some of the major nationally and internationally recognized terrorism databases and research centers that you hear about until this day. And so that's places like the START Center at the University of Maryland, the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security at Duke University, and the Terrorism Research Center at the University of Arkansas. It also includes some of the more comprehensive databases of terrorism and radicalization, so things like the Global Terrorism Database and the American Terrorism Study. And these initial investments after 9/11, they sort of came to a close around 2009. We kind of worked and funded some research related to that, and then those efforts sort of started to wind down. And then in 2012, we got a congressional mandate from Congress to fund research to, quote, develop a better understanding of the domestic radicalization phenomenon and advance evidence-based strategies for intervention and prevention, end quote. And so this is what turned out to be the inception of the new program that is to this day referred to as the Domestic Radicalization and Violent Extremism Research Portfolio. And fortunately, every year since 2012, we have been able to fund research projects under this mandate. And we now have over 50 studies totaling at, I think, over $30 million that kind of shed light on questions about a variety of subtopics, which includes things like the drivers of radicalization, the role that the internet and social media play in that radicalization process, and what works and what doesn't work when it comes to prevention and intervention programming. You'll see that, this 2012 mandate was a pretty significant shift from what the initial investments sort of in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 were. So the mandate in 2012 really kind of turned our attention to what some people may call the pre-crime space, where we're trying to prevent and intervene against terrorism, which is where we want to be, right? We want to be sort of ahead of the curve and ahead of the problem and focus on prevention and intervention before a person engages in a violent extremist act. So this mandate kind of pushed us to move our understanding about the causes of radicalization to violent extremism forward. We're trying to understand, how to identify individuals who are radicalizing first and foremost, and that means sort of figuring out the signs and the signals that they might be giving off, how they can be detected early on by peers, and by peers I mean family members and friends who our research shows are the most likely to, first see the signs of possible radicalization, but are the least likely to report for various reasons that Kat will kind of go over. So that's kind of the key, right? To understanding what we're doing at NIJ. We're trying to understand how and why people radicalize, and we do that by supporting, new science through our research grants and making sure that we're working with as many of our federal partners as we can, and most importantly, that right now includes the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate. So that is a little bit about our program. So more specifically, so when the program was first launched in 2012, the goal of the new research portfolio was to answer three main questions. So what are the primary drivers of radicalization to violent extremism? How do they vary across cohorts? So by grievance, by age, by socioeconomic status. How is radicalization to violent extremism analogous to other forms of mass violence? Or violent crime. What policy choices or programmatic interventions prevent or reduce radicalization to violent extremism, induce disengagement from violent extremism, or support de-radicalization and desistance from violent extremism? And as we'll discuss shortly, many of the awards funded through these solicitations have helped answer or shed light on some of these questions. However, as the field of terrorism studies has evolved, in addition to the changing nature of the threat that we're facing in the U.S., NIJ has started funding awards that might help explain some of the more nuanced challenges and threats that we're facing. So let's take a moment to discuss some of those changing threats and the changing responses to it. So obviously we've seen sort of terrorism growing at alarming rates in recent years. We saw a pretty stark increase in both the number and lethality of terrorist attacks in the country. This trend really seemed to peak in 2015 and kind of increased through 2018, and then we saw a dip a bit in 2019. And of course, then the pandemic happened and completely changed our way of life. But despite that, we still witnessed some pretty historic and horrific events during and after the pandemic that really brought about awareness of a different type of extremism that was perhaps less talked about in the news and in social media. And so along with sort of the decline of ISIS, we concurrently saw a rise in racially and ethnically motivated terrorism as well as political extremism, both in the United States and abroad. A lot of the more recent attacks we also found were attributed to very diverse and complex ideologies, and sometimes there wasn't, allegiance to a particular group or form of extremism. We saw a bunch of ideologies also melding. So in order to prevent and intervene against terrorism, we as a field are constantly trying to improve our understanding of the causes of radicalization to violent extremism, and again, working on how to identify individuals who are radicalizing and how to stop them before they commit an act of terror. In order to better understand these threats, our solicitation, which we put out on an annual basis, seeks applications for funding for research and evaluation projects that address the knowledge gaps related to preventing radicalization to violent extremism with sort of clear implications for criminal justice policy and practice in the United States. So specifically, we've been looking for proposals in 4 topic areas, and those are listed there. So research to inform, terrorism prevention efforts, or sort of our more conventional, basic type of research. Research on the role of communications in radicalization, because so much radicalization actually does happen online now and through written communication, so it's very important to study it. And also research on the reintegration of individuals convicted for terrorism-related offenses, and evaluations of programs and and practices. We'll go over some of these topics in more detail in the next few slides, but within all 4 of these areas of focus, we're looking for research that explores the radicalization of Americans to all forms of terrorism, and kind of engages researcher practitioner partnerships. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the actual solicitation. So I just kind of went over the 4 topic areas. Under the first topic area, just to elaborate a little bit more, we're looking for applications that build and improve on existing national and international research in the area of terrorism prevention, including research that improves on program development, data sources, and methods. So we're encouraging studies about risk and protective factors as they relate to radicalization and terrorism within the evolving terrorist threat landscape in the U.S., and we're also particularly interested in developing and understanding how the radicalization process is similar or different based on the types of extremist ideologies that are kind of coming to the forefront of the threat landscape. Again, as it regards the spectrum of political ideologies, NIJ has and continues to be sort of agnostic to ideology. In other words, Congress has mandated that we fund research on projects that study the causes of radicalization to any and all forms of extremism. Under topic area 2, we're looking at research that kind of better helps us better understand the dynamic role of communications and media platforms, both social media and mass media, in radicalization to violent extremism ideologies. We're encouraging applicants to propose research that identifies strategies and best practices to bolster resistance. So kind of like, how do we just increase digital media literacy and trying to understand when someone might be trying to share propaganda or persuade us towards sort of like violent ideologies, violent extremist ideologies, and then also research on effective technologies and tools for identification, moderation, or removal of extremist content. We want the research results from the projects funded under this topic to have an end goal of informing sort of effective counter-messaging campaigns. Throughout the whole solicitation, but especially under this sort of subtopic, we expect applicants to ensure that they are proposing research that respects constitutional protections for expression, for association, free speech, and we don't allow an applicant to focus sort of solely on social media data and kind of want that research project to be paired up with some another offline component as well. Under topic area 3, so, it was around 2017 or 2018 that the field kind of started talking a little bit about, folks who had been incarcerated for terrorism-related offenses, particularly right after 9/11, and they were starting to be released. And there was a lot of talk about, okay, well, what do we do with these people? What are their risks? What are their needs? And how do we successfully reintegrate them back into our societies? And we found that there was a lot of consensus on the fact that we didn't know what these individuals, what type of risk they posed, or what their needs were for successful reintegration. And so in fiscal year 2019, actually, for the first time ever, we put this topic area on one of our solicitations, and we got a few responses for it, and some studies that are focusing on that. And then lastly, topic area 4, just looking at evaluations of programs and practices to prevent terrorism. Kat is going to go into a lot more detail about this, but just looking at formative evaluations and evaluability assessments and outcome evaluations of terrorism prevention programs. So there are, as she will share, a lot of challenges associated with this and a lot of lessons learned, but even those lessons that we learned from that are really kind of valuable in informing our work. I'm sorry, I kind of did a slide out of order, but I did want to go over this. A few slides ago, we talked about how the threat landscape was changing, right? And of course, that's a cause for us to change our solicitation as well. So we want to keep up with the time. So some of the changes that we saw were, first and foremost, being an increase in funding that we began to get from Congress every year. And that kind of really reiterates what a national priority this is. So the Senate and the House sort of propose budgets, and then there's one that's finally approved and given to us, and we have to spend that money on certain research projects related to this specific mandate. And so generally, we've been seeing that money increase on an annual basis. When it sort of comes to funding, the question of how many awards we anticipate actually funding really varies from year to year. We've had as many as 8 applications awarded in a single year, and as little as 2. The average amount that's typically awarded is around $750,000, but we've had applications that have proposed as much as 1.7 million and some as low as 400,000. So that's kind of like giving you guys an idea of the amount of money that's given to each project. We also updated our solicitation, as I just sort of reiterated, that with these 2 areas of focus. And in topic area 1, we've really kind of shown an interest in trying to understand the unique violent extremism threat landscape in the U.S., and in particular, what grievances are now driving that radicalization. It's a lot different from sort of the aftermath of 9/11 and where we are today. But also, we for the first time ever, and especially since the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism was released in June of 2021, we added this subtopic or research area of focus, kind of focusing on mis-, and malinformation and how to sort of understand how that spreads and how to counter it. Next, there is some language in the solicitation that specifically calls out certain groups or ideologies that promote potential violent extremism. And I want to reiterate again that, NIJ funds research on all types of extremist ideologies, and that will continue funding research on radicalization to any form of extreme violence, but we also recognize that the applications that we receive each year are in line with the field and with the current threat landscape. And so for the first time in FY20, Congress specifically mandated NIJ to dedicate a portion of the funds to white nationalist extremism. So this year we didn't, receive a mandate to focus on any one particular ideology or group, but we also recognize that this threat has sort of come to the forefront of the threat landscape, and that's something that we specifically solicited. And then lastly, we're also looking to kind of increase diversity in perspective. So, the research that we do is very important, and the research subjects are very important, but also, the researchers. So trying to make sure that, our researchers come from diverse backgrounds, they're multidisciplinary, they're not just looking from a strictly criminological or psychological perspective, but have, so many different expertise involved in the research team. So for FY23, again, this is kind of the highlights. We were, sort of given a certain amount of money. We're focusing more so on domestic violent extremist ideologies. There was a big focus on sort of safeguarding our democratic principles and institutions, trying to understand long-term drivers of radicalization, mistis and malinformation, so MDM, and the broader role of communications and diversity in extremism research. So I want to take a minute to talk about the review process and how funding decisions are made. Again, sort of boring, but necessary to understand, how this research is funded. So once an application passes the basic minimum requirements, so all the critical components like the abstract and the budget are in the application, it moves on to an external peer review process. And the external peer review panels are made up of researchers and practitioners in the fields relevant to the solicitation. So they score applications and discuss them, and then they provide NIJ with the merits or the critiques of the application. External peer reviewers use kind of the following rubric to assess each application. So statement of the problem, does the applicant understand the problem? Are they showing an understanding of the most current literature that's out there? Are they asking the right research questions? Project design and implementation, so we're kind of looking at the rigor of the research methods proposed. Is the project feasible? Can they actually carry it out? Potential impact, so how much value will it add to addressing the problem of or increasing our understanding of radicalization to violent extremism? And then lastly, capabilities and competencies. So are they, sort of well suited? Do they have the education and the expertise to, and the relationships in place actually to successfully carry out the project? And budget is of course self-explanatory. NIJ then uses these scores and comments to conduct its own internal review of the applications. And that review process consists of NIJ science staff and leadership at NIJ kind of reviewing and talking to other relevant experts who may be able to weigh in on the merits of the application, and taking into consideration the scores and comments provided by the external peer reviewers, as well as the budget, and then providing these recommendations to the NIJ director. And the NIJ director, who is a political appointee, has the final say, and the funding decisions are made at the discretion of the NIJ director. So in a nutshell, we want our projects to be sort of well-written, feasible, impactful, timely, and innovative, and just really clear. So this kind of gives you a little idea of how many applications we receive each year and how many awards we actually end up funding. We want our projects to have an understanding of the current extremist threat, and the existing literature and the work that's already been funded by NIJ. We want the applications to be easy to read, and straightforward and explicit, and there shouldn't be any mystery around sort of what is being proposed. And we want the most rigorous research designs. There are three sort of key deliverables that our grantees are expected to provide. So a final research report, any data sets that are associated with that, any documentation, and scholarly products. And that's where you can see sort of from this graphic that to date we have over 600 products that have come about as a result of our funded research under this portfolio, with the two most common being, of course, presentations and peer-reviewed journal articles. But we are trying to change that, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. So what have we learned? We actually commissioned some synthesis papers a few years ago summarizing findings from 15 NIJ-funded studies. And one of the major findings was that there are actually some pretty common risk factors or things that make someone more likely to radicalize, that were shared factors across various ideologies and were present both within group-based and lone actor terrorists. And so just a few of those risk factors were, for example, having a criminal history, having mental health issues, being unemployed, being single, being socially isolated, and having military experience. And that's actually a pretty important finding for us because NIJ doesn't really study any one particular form of extremism. We've always been sort of agnostic, as I said, to ideology. And so having this information was very helpful. On the one hand, that makes our research portfolio pretty broad, but it's also more encompassing of the totality of the problem here in America. And as we all know, many of you are probably much better than I do, that radicalization of violent extremism is a pretty complex phenomenon. And so not only are terrorist acts carried out by people with different ideologies, those groups also have somewhat nuanced radicalization processes. And again, Kat's going to be kind of going over more of all of this. So that is what I have for that slide. Aside from the synthesis papers, of course, we publish all the final reports to our website and to the National Archives, and I'll briefly highlight some of the projects that have closed and a few key findings from them. So in terms of comparative studies, the Violent Extremism and Gangs Project through the University of Maryland found that their study results indicated a low level of overlap between extremist groups and gangs, and point to factors that may compel people to join these groups at different stages of the life course. The study also identified a variety of risk factors that are foundational in developing resilience within individuals and communities to gang and extremist group involvement. And as we talk increasingly about, de-radicalization and disengagement more and more as a society, I think the next two slides listed here are really interesting. The next two studies listed here are really interesting. The empirical assessment one, the EAD3, also out of the University of Maryland, and the Exit USA study by RTI are really good reads. The EAD3 study team conducted 41 in-depth life history interviews with 21 former far-right extremists, 13 far-left extremists, and 7 former jihadi-inspired extremists. And the Exit USA studies data consisted of 47 in-depth life history interviews with former members of domestic white supremacist organizations across 24 states in all regions of the U.S. and 2 regions in Canada. And these researchers really kind of delved into the extremist identity transformations, their life histories, they studied the group dynamics and the exit process, and they tried to better understand the unique needs and culturally responsive resources and implications for service providers in both supervised and non-supervised settings. And another interesting one is the Longevity of American Terrorists, Factors Affecting Sustainability study out of the University of Arkansas. The study was intended to, identify factors and behaviors that terrorists had engaged in that significantly improved their chances of avoiding arrest. And the research team found several major findings, some of which included things like the lifespan of terrorists, decreased significantly based on the amount of discretion law enforcement was given to employ investigative techniques, or that longevity of terrorists varied significantly by ideology, with environmental and far-left terrorists sustaining themselves for substantially longer periods of time than far-right or Islamist extremists. With far-left environmental terrorists averaging 5.4 and 4.3 years, respectively. And in contrast to that, the longevity of far-right and Islamic extremists was, on average, 2 years or less. So just kind of some interesting findings. I won't, bore you with more because Kat's got much more comprehensive findings to share with you all. And then I just want to take a moment to also share a few of these. The question of, we've learned so much about the drivers of radicalization, similarities and differences between terrorism and other forms of violent crime. We also have learned that a majority of recruitment and radicalization occurs over the internet and through social media, and that's only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Well, one of the most important findings may be that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to these questions. There's no single checklist that determines whether someone is on the path to becoming a terrorist, and at the same time, as we discussed, we have different ideologies technologies coming to the forefront of our national threat landscape. And so this presents new challenges in areas that need to be researched. So in an attempt to sort of meet that need, we're supporting significant new areas of inquiry in our radicalization portfolio. I've listed a few ongoing studies here, but just to give you guys an overview, we're trying to take a closer look at some of the reasons why people are hesitant to come forward and report things to authorities that might help law enforcement prevent or intervene during the commission of a terrorist act. We're funding researchers to talk with former extremists, both within and outside of these sort of populations that we discussed earlier, and their families and friends, and what they think could have been helpful resources or sort of critical points of intervention. We're also trying to better understand how local communities can work together and draw on different sectors like education, like public health, social services, et cetera, to help those who may be on the path towards radicalization, and how to make those efforts sort of practically feasible. And of course, we're continuing to fund studies to help us better understand the semantics and rhetoric being used to recruit and amplify extremist voices and actions. So we've been incredibly fortunate, as I said, to receive continuous funding under this mandate for the last 11 years. And to date, we have over 50 studies totaling at over $30 million that kind of shed light on a multitude of topics in this portfolio, some of which, I've already gotten into, some of which Kat will go over. And I think it comes as sort of no surprise that, we've been getting increased funding for these years. And as you can see in 2021, we had sort of the highest number of studies awarded out of the portfolio. You can see here a breakdown by topology. So we see that a lot of work funded by NIJ to date has focused on the radicalization process and risk factors. So again, trying to find points where terrorism can be prevented or intervened with. And so this is kind of where Kat's involvement comes into play. So we sort of embarked on this dissemination campaign, and we figured, all right, it's been a few years since we've conducted these synthesis projects, and we need to sort of overhaul all of our research findings again and look at, what our projects are telling us. And so we did a few different things. We had a Research for the Real World sort of virtual seminar where we brought together experts to kind of discuss the changing threat landscape and how to combat it and what research can do to sort of support that. We dedicated an issue of the NIJ Journal, which will be coming out later this year, and we recorded podcasts which were also published, focused on this topic. So all of these things are going to be included in the links that Vic sends you later on. It's a few different ways to kind of intake this information and digest it. So we hope that will be helpful for you. And we also asked Kat to synthesize our research for us. So she and her partner author also kind of wrote these longer synthesis papers for us, but also put together these sort of 5 things you need to know documents. And the hope is that these are sort of like 2-page, at most 3-page documents that kind of give the readers like 5 key takeaways about different topics related to our research, and the 4 sort of papers and topics that she kind of honed in on were lessons learned from evaluations of prevention and intervention programs, the role of social media in the radicalization process, the role of social networks, both online and offline, in the radicalization process, and again, how violent extremism compares to other types of crimes like mass shootings and like hate crimes. So I think I'll be turning it over to Kat very shortly here. I just want to say that, I've talked to Vic, and we'll be sending out the links, as I mentioned, through his outreach, and I hope that will be incredibly helpful for you, and not as boring as me standing up here and talking. If you're looking to explore on your own, though, you can visit our website. You can just go to nij.gov and type in the keyword terrorism, and you'll be brought to our sort of landing page where you will be able to access some of the resources that I mentioned and some that are still forthcoming. All right, I think that is it. Thank you so much for having me again and for kind of being here today. You could have been anywhere, but thank you for choosing to be here and kind of intake this information. If you have any questions, comments, I'm happy to take those. During the symposium, you can come up during a break or anything, but you can also feel free to email me. My email address is here if you have any questions or, things that you'd like to discuss. I think without any further ado, I will turn it over to Kat or Vic, whoever will be taking
First
over.
of all, Aisha, thank you very much. Please, you gotta have a question, right? I'll tell you what, the first question will get a YouTube challenge. Okay? If you get any questions, anyone?
So I did have, in reference to trends, ma'am, what are you capturing like in our local region as far as extremist groups?
So we don't have data on local trends. That is something that our researchers, like the funders, the people that we fund, capture. I'm happy to provide you with the research. So it's like have you visited the Start Center's website? They have like a really interactive map, and you're able to filter and kind of filter by location essentially and see the trends that are happening there. They are, a center that is partially funded by us, and they are the ones who capture that information.
If you'd like, if that's an interest to everyone else, I will send that. The START program is run by the University of Maryland, and I'll be more than happy to send you a link with the other links on that that'll take you to that research. The beauty about this research, it's already funded by either NIJ, Department of Homeland Security, and it's there for the taking for you.
Yeah.
Right. As long as you know where the links are, the resources are, you can download all that info. And the best thing is that every project has an author, and it has their contact info. And I would encourage you, don't be shy on that, because I have not met a researcher that does not like to talk about the research. If you send them and say it's very interesting, I'd like to learn more about that, don't be surprised if they contact you back. And you speak to your agents as well. So it's a great question.
Yeah, and it is very self-explanatory. It's really just you filter by all the things that you're looking for, even by ideology, and they've got types of attacks, fatalities, and it's just an incredible way to filter down and kind of see what's going on in your area.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much again for joining us today. My name is Kateira Aryaeinejad. I've been working in research related to violent extremism and terrorism for quite some time. And as Vic mentioned, nearly across the world, not everywhere, but I've been able to get some breadth in terms of geographic coverage, which has been really beneficial in terms of looking back at the United States as well. Before I get started, a couple things. One, I know I have a fairly quiet voice, so if you can't hear me, please just let me know, and I'll be happy to project more. Two, this is going to be a fairly long conversation, a very long presentation about 4 different synthesis projects that my colleague, Dr. Tom Shearer, and I had done over the past year for the National Institute of Justice and Aisha. Rather than me having to speak for 50 minutes, if you guys want to do me a favor and ask any questions you have or raise your hands throughout the presentation, please do so. It saves me. It allows you an opportunity to kind of ask your questions throughout different topics and transitions of topics. And mostly I'm just being selfish. It saves my voice. So thank you. Before I really get started, though, I do want to thank Vic, thank Aisha, thank Vic, your entire team, and the University of El Paso for hosting us today. We're really excited to talk through some of the synthesized findings from the past couple of years of NIJ's work. This was a wonderful project to work on. It involved a lot of effort and a lot of brain power on my part and my colleague Tom's part, who unfortunately is not here today, but I'll give you a little bit more information about him as well. And it really helped us kind of reconceptualize. It's good to look back sometimes because you remember that, some things haven't actually changed. Some lessons that were there kind of got buried in the past, and it's good to kind of rehash those and figure out where we're moving forward. I'm going to give some disclaimers before I start on the rest of the presentation because everybody likes a good disclaimer. So the first is that my presentation here and my work on the synthesis project are in my personal capacity only. They're in no way affiliated with my broader organizational, professional, and personal affiliations. So laying that out there. The views expressed are also not necessarily representative of any of my broader personal and professional affiliations. Love a good disclaimer. And second, just for background, the synthesis project and the 4 studies that I will be presenting on today were funded by the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice, and the opinions and views represented in this presentation and in the ultimate reports are those of my own and Thomas Shearer, who is not here today, and don't necessarily reflect the official position of the Department of Justice. So thank you guys all for joining again, and let's get started if I can figure out how to be technologically literate again. So Aisha gave us a little bit of background on some of the previous synthesis efforts that have been spawned through NIJ's research focused on domestic radicalization to terrorism. This synthesis effort, as Aisha mentioned, took place over the last year and involved a very broad review at first for 4 specific topics. So the first topic being the role of social networks in radicalization, and in disengagement. The second being internet and social media and its role in radicalization in the domestic space. The third on learning from evaluations, so reviewing some of the formative impact and outcome evaluations funded by NIJ over the past couple years to learn different lessons. I say evaluation now, I will make a plug for Vic. Please fill out your surveys. Evaluations are very important and they're very difficult a lot of the times because there's not enough data. So do your part, and thank you. And then the final project, which was one of my favorite, was comparing the profiles of individuals who had radicalized to violent extremism or committed violent extremist crimes to those who had committed similar types of violent crimes, so mass shootings and hate or bias crimes. And I will get more into that in the next slide. Conducting, I guess, this review and synthesis, my colleague Thomas Shearer and I reviewed over 40 of NIJ's grants they had funded in the past, on both in terms of the portfolio related to domestic radicalization to terrorism, but also from alternative portfolios as well, the portfolio on mass shootings and the portfolio on hate and bias crimes. We're really able to dig into a lot of the different findings. Not all of them, unfortunately, informed the final products. They were at varying stages. So some were completed, some were kind of ongoing at the time, some were relevant to the 4 questions we were asked to answer, others were not so much relevant. So at the end, we drew primarily from 33 grants and different research products that had been funded out of them in creating our synthesis projects. The 4 questions I've already mentioned, I'll get to a little bit on the next slide, but this effort resulted in 4 synthesis reports. And these reports go through very specific information about the different findings from these grants and, their focus, their comparability, their limitations, their caveats, etc. Synthesized findings based on the extent to which we can compare a lot of this information for policy and practice, and then gaps and recommendations for future efforts, both in the research space and in the policy and practice space. These are accompanied by 4 5 Things brochures. So Aisha had shown a slide about the 5 Things brochures from previous efforts in her presentation. We are hoping those will be published soon, but publications are publications, so we will let you know, right? Correct. Awesome. Okay. So, moving on to the 4 topics. We've talked a little bit about this before. I think the most important kind of aspect of these topics is that they are still topics that both in the domestic and international space continue to plague researchers and policymakers and practitioners, especially when we're thinking about prevention. So what role do social ties and social networks actually play in facilitating entry into or engagement in violent acts versus in preventing an individual and establishing, some type of community resiliency that does enable people to kind of evade or elude the pull of certain radicalizing dynamics. What is the role of internet and social media? It varies all over the place. It's a very complex topic. You're going to hear me say complex a lot. I know that's very frustrating. I also don't like hearing that. It does sound like a cop-out sometimes, but in reality, these are incredibly highly individualized, complex, and context-dependent issues that we're dealing with, so complexity is really important to understand. We're going to try to give you some framing to make better sense of that complexity. Although, again, as Aisha had mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There's no one-size-fits-all profile to an individual who radicalizes and to disengaging and rehabilitating that individual as well. Evaluating and assessing terrorism prevention programs is a thorn in everyone's side. It is notoriously difficult. So we'll get into some of the challenges there and some opportunities to improve those programs based on lessons. And again, there's so many overlaps between different forms of violence. It gets very difficult to understand what is violent extremism versus what is, a different type of violence, especially because they overlap so many times. And they don't necessarily have clear and concrete definitions. So how do you define violent extremism versus a hate crime? Complex problems, still an issue in the international and domestic space. So we're really excited to share some lessons about those. Obviously, a lot of these topics are inherently intertwined. Social networks are intertwined with internet, social media, and radicalization, which are intertwined with terrorism prevention programs, aim to address those. So at the end of this presentation, I'll be giving an overview of some of those overlaps in terms of the findings to kind of tie all of these different topics together. Any questions so far? Cool. I will call on you guys. So, all right. Moving into caveats and limitations before we dig into findings. Again, everybody's favorite topic. As I mentioned before, a lot of, and as again from Aisha's presentation, a lot of these research projects are varied, so they're not necessarily comparable. They took place in different time periods, they focused on different geographies, they focused on different ideological strands, and they focused on different kind of demographic information. So while these are not necessarily comparable in a scientific sense, what we've attempted to do is bridge together and kind of put together a puzzle where while we're not saying these are, fully generalizable findings and fully generalizable insights, they do give us some sense of, where overlaps might be and where we should continue to explore and make considerations based on those overlaps. And to further deal with these, a portion of our synthesis effort focused on framing. So making different frames that would help us kind of facilitate that comparison to the extent possible, but also make sense of, again, the complexity. So complexity, again, that characterizes a lot of these dynamics. So let's get started on the role of social networks in facilitating and preventing domestic radicalization. Social networks have historically been seen as a very integral portion of decisions to engage in or defect from violent extremism around the world, and including in the United States, of course. They're often seen, many radicalization decisions are attributed to familial ties, to gaps in familial understanding, to peers who would also join these different groups. But again, this varies from an individual to individual level, and so the question is, what types of ties, what types of friendship actually facilitates or changes someone's mind and facilitates their mobilization into violent action and violent groups. To do this, we looked at about 7 projects. These projects included a number of projects looking at disengagement, prevention, and radicalization among individuals who had joined different groups, from the far left to the far right to jihadist and other types of violent extremism. We also included studies that looked at lone actors to gauge whether or not social networks actually played a role in their decision to radicalize or their decision to engage in violent extremist activities. In doing so, And in reviewing a lot of the materials, again, some of it was rather disparate, we decided to construct a frame to help us make sense of beyond just, did a friend encourage you to join? Did a family member encourage you to defect? How do we make sense of different types of social relationships? So we categorize these into two main constructs. First, organic social networks. And by organic social networks, I mean family ties, pre-existing social ties, the community that you're embedded in. These are social networks that you have, but you can't necessarily choose all of the time. To an extent, you can choose your neighbors by choosing your neighborhood, but you can't self-select exactly who is your neighbor, unless you're perhaps really rich, and in that case, good for you. But a little bit more difficult to do that in the real world. Constructed social relationships, rather, are those relationships that we do choose, that we do seek out, that we do actively try to foster. So these are friendships. These are relationships with individuals that we perhaps idolize. These are romantic relationships, other types of relationships that we choose to pursue rather than having, kind of a part of us organically. And of course, recognizing that individual factors, perceptions, and experiences necessarily shape radicalization outcomes, we went ahead and threw that into caveats. Caveats are fun. But again, our real impetus was looking through a lot of these different studies and trying to figure out whether organic and constructed social networks actually played a role in these decisions, and if so, what role? Were they a gatekeeper? Were they, kind of a gateway to radicalization? How did this actually play out in practice? So, moving on to the findings. We've detailed 5 here that kind of give us a good idea of what the full body of literature actually told us about this. So number 1 might not be a surprise, or at least a portion of it might not be a surprise. But radicalization is an inherently social process, and this is even so among lone actors. There is a perception that lone actors are often socially isolated. They don't necessarily have social networks. They live in their own head, they live in their own world. But studies funded by the National Institute of Justice pointed to very concrete social ties, primarily constructed through online communities and actual in-person relationships, many of which involved, again, an idolized individual, somebody who was seen as a hero, somebody who was seen as a leader in an extremist movement, who these so-called lone actors wanted to kind of venerate and impress. So even though we consider lone actors to be somewhat separate from those that participate in groups and group activities, the role of social networks there can be quite strong. Number 2, social isolation from non-extremist groups and the size of extremist groups can both impact radicalization to violence. So social isolation, we're talking here, is about social isolation from both constructed and organic friendship, peer groups, social networks. Individuals who continued along a path of socially isolating them from previous friends, friends who did not necessarily believe in non-extremist ideologies, from family members who were trying to dissuade them from joining or kind of pursuing and continuing to radicalize along the path that they were on. That increasing social isolation in some studies was shown to actually, in effect, increase the radicalization of those individuals to the extent that you can actually measure that. So isolating from individuals who would otherwise provide protective factors, again, both organic and constructed relationships, was seen as a precursor to or a factor facilitating increased radicalization and potentially a risk factor. So looking out for relationships and strains in relationships as a potential indicator of increasing radicalization and mobilization to violence. The size of extremist groups was also shown to potentially have an impact on the decisions to radicalize to violence. This varied. So some of this smaller extremist groups were seen to be a little bit more tight-knit and therefore a little bit more susceptible to groupthink, I guess you could say, right? Whereas larger kind of dispersed extremist networks, including those online, weren't necessarily as, according to some of the studies, as instrumental in actually encouraging acts of violence. Number 3, while important, family connections are not a reliable safeguard against radicalization. So there has been a body of work that has suggested that increasing familial involvement in different lives, increasing, knowledge about parenting practices, etc., will lead to resilience to radicalization to violence. Various studies conducted with NIJ funding showed that that's not necessarily the case. I mean, at least not necessarily in theory. It could be different in practice. But that even in circumstances where families tried to intervene, when they recognized that an individual is on a path to violence and radicalization, they weren't necessarily able to. And this kind of coincides with this social isolation process. The further their efforts went to try to intervene in this process, the further that individual had pulled away. These are based on very isolated case studies, so again, this isn't necessarily generalizable, but it is an important consideration moving forward. Finally, peers have a meaningful influence on pathways both into and out of radicalization. This includes peers in terms of random strangers, as well as peers in terms of friend groups and in terms of romantic relationships. The role of romantic relationships was a very interesting one, with a study on disengagement and rehabilitation, specifically noting that when an individual had changed a romantic partner, a non-extremist romantic partner, that had actually been seen to encourage disengagement from extremist views and extremist groups. Same thing with meeting individuals who had previously been perceived as being an outgroup by an extremist group. Outgroup being not part of, the group, the ideology. That meeting those individuals and having social relationships was shown by specific studies to encourage decisions to defect or at least disengage from the ideology that had been inculcated within them during their time in an extremist group. This, of course, has various caveats. First, that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So various factors, including economic factors, including factors related to incarceration, prospects when leaving a group, and also familial ties also impacted the extent to which these peer networks were meaningful in terms of their influence. But again, something to consider when considering radicalization pathways. And then finally, the impact of social networks on both radicalization and disengagement varies. Some social networks, some networks with extremist ties, will inevitably help facilitate and mobilize individuals to join different violent extremist groups, whereas others might not necessarily have the same pull. So viewing social networks as a both cause and consequence of joining violent extremist movements or disengaging from them is not, it's complex. Again, it's very complex. A number of different factors are involved, many of them socioeconomic, and many of them related to the context in which these individuals are living. Importantly, other factors, including identity construction, ideological affiliation, and commitment, specifically will also have an impact on the role of social networks in radicalization processes. So I'm going to pause there for a little bit before moving on to the role of internet and social media on radicalization for any questions, in case anybody wants to save my voice very quickly, as it slowly gets raspier.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On the 5 findings, or 5 top findings on that, what surprised you the most that didn't show up? You look at these projects, we all come in thinking we expect things to show up. What didn't show up that you thought might show up?
I think the thing that surprised me the most was the importance of in-person rather than just online communications and networks. This was a study, I think, actually conducted by the Michigan State University. So I have a full listing of all of these studies as well that I can send around. I realize they're not in the slides. but that when in person, even in instances where individuals had engaged online with social networks and peers in a violent extremist fashion, I guess you could say, it was the offline connections, either with those same individuals with who they had engaged online or other individuals that actually encouraged mobilization. So the online alone wasn't necessarily as sufficient. It was the offline, the in-person, the very tangible relationship. And that's something that we've seen in literature before, but seeing it again in this in these studies was very, very interesting. Yeah. And on that note, going to the internet and social media. All right, so I think we all know that in discussions of the internet and social media and radicalization, it can be very challenging and very difficult to parse out, what is actual radicalization, what is actual violent extremist material and content, and how do these things work together to inspire or individuals to radicalize in offline settings or engage with said content. There's been a lot of research on this recently. Some of the best research, I think, and I've used this research for years, has been from NIJ-sponsored studies. I do not say that lightly. I do actually mean that. But understanding, the actual role can be very difficult because we all use the internet every day. Internet, social media, very embedded in our everyday life. We don't necessarily even recognize that we're using it most of the time. I don't, which might be a problem for myself. But we don't necessarily recognize the extent to which it is embedded in our everyday lives, and need to better understand how we use it and how violent extremist groups and other individuals use it to encourage radicalization. So we reviewed a number of different projects that focus to some extent on the internet and social media. Some of these were duplicates of the research that we had reviewed for the social networks project. So disclaimer there, because they were, necessarily part of the same subject matter. And found that the internet had been used in a variety of ways of different individuals who had radicalized to violent extremism, and in ways that we don't necessarily consider all of the time. We tend to think of social media and the internet as a monolith, but again, the way we use it definitely varies. So to make sense of some of the findings from the body of research that we had looked at, we developed another frame, focusing on a couple different ways in which the internet is used to better understand how we address it, how we understand it, and how we create policy and programs to mitigate risks in the online space. So first and foremost is exploitation. And exploitation refers to how individuals and groups use online spaces to spread extremist ideologies and further their goals. This is the most indicative, I would posit, aspect of violent extremism online, but it does entail active use of the internet to spread or to mobilize based on violent extremist ideologies, to spread content, to spread propaganda, to recruit members through different chat rooms. This is all exploitation. And a lot of these different categories do inherently overlap. So for example, the next category, engagement, that refers to how individuals engage with others and consume violent extremist materials and content online, and including how that content and materials can in turn affect radicalization and trajectories. So the important thing here is that engagement does not necessarily equate with propensity. You can engage with violent extremist materials online. You can come across them, you can comment on them, you can share them, but that doesn't necessarily make you any more likely to actually engage in violence or radicalize. I have seen violent extremist materials online. That doesn't necessarily make me any more likely than anybody else to radicalize in this space. I realize that sounds weird when it comes out, but I think you get my meaning, so yeah. Those who engage with materials and individuals online that do have, that do follow violent extremist ideologies and promote violence can also exploit the online space. So just because an individual is involved in exploitation doesn't necessarily mean that they won't be involved in engagement. These are kind of fluid categories, which is why you have these different, it's the wrong mice, but these different arrows throughout. The broadest category at the bottom of this pyramid is risk. So risk refers to how an individual's online behaviors and individual factors may put them at risk of interacting, engaging, or potentially radicalizing, interacting, engaging, or potentially viewing radicalizing or violent extremist content. So risk is different from engagement. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are in spaces where violent extremist content is present, but it does mean that your behaviors and your activities online may increase the likelihood that you will come across that content. Again, it doesn't necessarily equate with propensity to commit violence or to radicalize or join a violent extremist group or even believe in a violent extremist ideology. It just means that the behaviors that you adapt, the understanding that you have of online risk is such that you might be more likely or less likely to actually view this type of content or come across it in an online space. And then the final category is mitigation, and mitigation is kind of embedded within all of these. It's on the outside, but it's very relevant to each, and that refers to protective factors. So that can be policies, that can be individual behaviors and characteristics, that can be programs, that can be social networks or other ties or education. These are protective factors that divert or intervene when an individual is at risk, engaging in or exploiting the internet and social media spaces with violent extremist content. So, given that framing, which kind of gives us a better idea of, again, the differences between some of this research. We don't want to overgeneralize research on risk with research on exploitation. Because you're at risk doesn't mean that you're exploiting. And these are really important factors to consider. So 5 key findings on the role of the internet and social media. The first being that the connection between radicalization and the internet is necessarily complex. You get the word again. And it depends on individual and offline factors. Many of these studies focused on, again, the area related to risk and engagement more so than exploitation, which is to be expected because it is very difficult to address and research exploitation in an online context. And found that different factors, including level of education, including political views, including peer networks, including engagement with strangers online, had an impact on the propensity to, again, view this content or engage in spaces where it was present. That being said, the line between viewing the content and radicalization is very opaque and very difficult to sometimes assess. 2 is that individuals who engage with extremist materials online and online networks, the reasons why they engage vary. So a study from the University of Maryland focused on far-right forums found specifically that individuals engaged in far-right forums for a variety of different reasons. Some engaged to be social. Some engaged to share their own ideas. Others lurked behind and used these different platforms as information gathering resources. So even within one platform, the variety of uses based on an individual's own preferences, an individual's own appetite for engagement will vary. Again, something important to consider when looking at content housed within them. Spending more time online and on specific platforms may increase an individual's risk of engaging with hateful content. This is drawn from 2 studies that focus on youth, and specifically youth who had been spending more on time and using websites such as YouTube and Facebook, in which they found that they had more of a likelihood to be exposed to or engage with hateful or potentially radicalizing content. This is an interesting finding because it is related to the following 2. So 1, that an individual's online interactions with others may increase their risk of exposure to hateful or potentially radicalizing content. Spending more time online, obviously you're more likely to find some different stuff online if you spend more time. Interacting with strangers and interacting with peers who are engaged in these other online spaces obviously will also increase your propensity to come across materials that you don't otherwise come across in online spaces. And finally, an individual's beliefs, characteristics, and behaviors may increase their risk of exposure. A very interesting study from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell also found that increasing somebody's awareness that they might be at risk increases their self-reporting of actually viewing hateful and potentially radicalizing content, because otherwise before they didn't actually understand that that content was necessarily hateful, bullying, radicalizing, etc. So the importance of education programs was very heavily underlined here as something to consider when reducing risk, or at least increasing awareness of what risk looks like in online environments, and hopefully creating some resilience within individuals who are engaged in those environments. Before I move on to evaluations, I will pause again so someone can save my voice. Which
you said that YouTube and Facebook was the more prevalent social medias. Was there certain users or certain creators that were promoting these radicalization?
So they didn't go into depth in that specific study. Interestingly, Instagram was seen as was referenced as the platform that had the least amount of that type of content. I believe that may have changed since then. I know I've seen a lot of studies coming out about how violent, extremist, and hateful content on Instagram has actually been increasing recently, so that would be something to look into. I will say, though, that some of the more specific studies, so University of Maryland studies in particular, did look at, again, these chat rooms and forums, and look at indications of who was seen as the most influential in those chat rooms and forums, with some really interesting findings, so I could direct you to that study as well. But yeah, they didn't go into too much depth on that, but would be an interesting gap for further research, so make a note of that. Yes?
So this may be part of your next presentation topic here, but did they notice any impacts from social media when companies decided to try to remove these extremist topics from their websites or platforms?
Not in these studies specifically, or that I can remember. I will caveat that very appropriately. But there are a few different NIJ-sponsored projects and evaluations of different, I guess you could call them internet resiliency projects for youth that are still ongoing that may have some very interesting findings in the next couple of years. And Aisha, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, and I also just kind of wanted to share that we've been seeing a lot of because of that sort of initiative to remove content or to monitor it, this push towards sort of non-conventional social media platforms like Telegram and 4chan and 8chan and all the other new things that are encrypted or in which their content moderation policies aren't present or are not as strict.
Yeah. So. And then there was they alluded to this a little bit as the study of far-right forums that I had mentioned before. They had looked at a chat room specific to women who were supportive of the Ku Klux Klan, with some really interesting findings about the nuance that went into language. I won't extrapolate those findings, but just to say that there have been other studies done in this space, in the online space, that have looked at how individuals and violent extremist groups, criminal groups, violent groups have massaged and nuanced their language, adopting pop culture references, adopting memes, of course, memification's really big, to avoid content moderation while continuing to symbolically spread messages within their networks who understand what the symbols mean. So that's been a big topic of conversation as well. And it makes it even harder to assess whether deplatforming actually works, and whether it's actually removing content that is kind of symbolizing specific meanings that we don't necessarily understand. And whether people actually mean what we assume they mean online, because again, when you generalize or when you adopt pop culture references, it's very difficult to tell whether somebody just really likes a movie or whether somebody's using a specific aspect of a movie to symbolize something else. So that's a little bit beyond this, but happy to talk more about that as well. All right.
Can I real quick?
Yeah.
So from a law enforcement perspective, we were just talking about this the other day, how it's so much harder for us to kind of monitor and be aware of the situations and the conversations that are happening because it is being pushed from the more popular social media options to some of those other ones that are less known or that don't kind of moderate that kind of conversation. So two things, like one, it's harder for us to kind of monitor that situation so that we're not able to track it as easily and be aware of it as easily. But two, and kind of on a positive side, does it hide it, then it makes it harder for a teenager or somebody that's looking for it to find it. Like it's not as open and available, or is that just me being naive? That the kids are able to access that stuff just as easily, even though it's not such a common platform?
Without having anything to back this up, I'll make an assumption.
Okay.
I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. If you don't know what you're engaging with, and I think this came out in some of the assessments of risks from the NIJ-sponsored studies, among youth specifically. If you don't understand the content of what you're engaging with, and you think it's like, Pepe the Frog is a great example of this. Pepe the Frog is not a violent extremist symbol. Pepe the Frog is a French cartoon of a very sad frog. It's cute. He had been adopted as a symbol of a certain type of group, right? And utilized in online spaces as a symbol that you were part of that group, that you had associated with the group, that you understood what that symbol meant on a very different level. If you had come across Pepe the Frog without actually understanding how it was being used online, you might think that's also super cute, because it's just a little sad French frog, right? And start to engage in those communities and start to also spread that symbol, which might symbolize to other people that you are also a part of that community. So it's really difficult, I mean, without stifling free speech, which is a huge issue online, it's very difficult to kind of assess how to deal with that type of communication outside of educational types of initiatives, which might not even fall into, I'll get into this a little bit more here, which might not even fall into like a preventing domestic terrorism or targeted prevention, violence prevention typology, but that's more educational in terms of online risks and the ways that different symbols are used in an online space.
Can I also share something? Just also from a law enforcement perspective, I think your point is really well taken that, when the content comes down or to, it makes it harder for you to identify or to locate certain things. And I think that's where, from a research perspective, we'd have proposals come in like, okay, we're looking at all content related to this hashtag on Twitter from 2015 to 2020, and it's kind of like, okay, that's retrospectively. But now I'm seeing the push go towards prospective research, and it's like, okay, we need to do this in real time and capture it because we don't understand what's being removed. We don't understand how it's being removed, the amount of content that's being removed, and so kind of doing prospective research, understanding in real time, and then creating tools for law enforcement to be able to prospectively, like you're anticipating an event, there's some kind of rally in your city or, some major event happening in your location, and, being able to kind of see what's coming to the forefront, what's trending essentially through those filters is really important. So
yeah.
I have a question on that. So are these platforms willing to share that information that they've removed pretty freely, or are they pretty protective of that information? I would assume.
No, they're pretty.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't want to speak for them, but there are different kind of information sharing networks that have been set up, especially between platforms. So the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism, GIFCT, it's a knowledge sharing, a hash sharing agreement between different social media platforms where if they recognize that something has been adopted that violates terms of service or has a terroristic or violent extremist kind of connotation to it, they automatically share that information between all of the social media companies who signed up to it, and it automatically takes it down. Well, I don't want to say automatically, but to kind of take it down and facilitate that. Unless you have anything else, I wouldn't be able to kind of comment on their own sharing policies, because I'm not
sure to what extent a researcher or law enforcement is able to say, hey, tell us, how much content you removed from X date to X date.
Meta used to post quarterly statements on how much content had been removed. I'm not sure if they've done that. I haven't looked into that in a while.
Meta will call, if they recognize that there's a post of self-harm or to harm to somebody else, they will call. So they'll call the Fusion Center and say that we've received this post, we want to kind of let you guys be aware of this so that we can go and take a look at it. So before they remove it and take it down, they will notify law enforcement, but they're the only ones that can get any reporting from on that kind of thing. None of the other social media sites do that.
Interesting. Perhaps in the email, I have a study that might be interesting for these conversations too, so and I'll flag a few from here. That's of use. Okay, any other questions?
So just when you're measuring something that says hateful or radicalizing content, you need a definition for that.
Yeah.
Because those are subjective terms.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the definition you're using for that?
So it varies based on the studies, which is why I've caveated against the comparability of a lot of these. Generally speaking, some of them have adopted definitions that fall into based on the ideology, right? So racist remarks, calls for violence, postings that are associated with a designated terrorist organization such as ISIS, etc. It really varies. I would love to share the reports with you. They'll go into a lot more detail than I can from up here. But it is a very subjective term. And again, that kind of speaks to the complexity in the online space, because ultimately we don't want to impinge on civil rights and liberties, obviously. But social media platforms do have their own content policies in terms of service. And so how does that actually equate with what the social media platform will allow versus what we think is, racist, violent extremist, kind of fringe belief, which is a constant issue. So I'll send you the list of each of the studies that we had used as well, perhaps through the links for each of these reports, if that's okay, with further information on them as well, because they all categorized it differently.
Right. Yeah, because a lot of the things that the social networks were censoring was just political speech. So
yeah, and that's problematic.
Yeah.
To say the least. Yeah. And I think, again, recognizing that in terms of venue framing, what is risk? Risk, again, is not propensity. It's just the space in which you are. It varies. Some lessens, some increases, versus what is engagement and exploitation and mitigation strategies for each of those. It's really important because the internet is not a monolith. And with artificial intelligence, it's about to be a whole lot different, maybe. I don't know. I'm not an artificial intelligence person. But yeah, understanding those distinctions instead of lumping into one category, I think based on what we've learned and based on a lot of this research can help us move past those type of very superficial level decision-making and analysis. So, any other questions? I think my voice is gonna make it. But we do have 2 left, so I might, Vic, we're kind of, how are we on time?
We're good on time.
We're good on time? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to move into our synthesis project on evaluations. And before I do so, I will remind you, of course, to please fill out the after-event survey. Very important, we need data. And I will get into why. So, looking at, the previous 2 studies, what are these different dynamics? How do we actually address those? And what programs and policies have we used to mitigate, prevent, and address violent extremism in the past? And what do we actually know about how well they worked? Again, complexity comes up again. All of this is very complex. It's very individualized. programs will only be suited to a certain amount of the population, and other individuals maybe not so much because of the very highly contextualized and individual dynamics that contribute to decisions to mobilize to violent extremism. So, based on NIJ's research, and evaluations, we looked at a couple different facets of program evaluations, including their findings, program evaluations based on program type, and some of the challenges, especially that they had faced in trying to assess their impact and efficacy in terms of their stated terrorism prevention goals. Monitoring and evaluation is a very complex topic. I don't want to bore you too much with it or get too deep in the weeds about it, but there are a number of different types of methods and a number of different types of just evaluations that comprise this broader field of monitoring and evaluation. Aisha mentioned a couple during her presentation earlier this morning: formative evaluations, so and evaluative assessments. So these are kind of like pre-evaluations, where you're evaluating the ripeness of a program to actually be evaluated, and the different resources that would be needed to actually conduct an evaluation of impact. Outcome and impact evaluations evaluate just that, outcomes and impacts measured against stated goals and theories of change. And then you also have fun things like process evaluations, which are, a lot of people like to call them bean counting evaluations, but they're really just, did you do what you said you would do? Checklist kind of exercises. And if not, what were the challenges that inhibited you from doing so? All of these evaluations have very valuable insights, but they will give you very different data in terms of the types of programs that you're assessing, whether you're assessing efficacy, whether you're assessing challenges, or whether you're assessing how to better construct programs and deliver them to audiences who will be receptive to them. So we looked at the body of NIJ-funded evaluations, including formative evaluations, outcome evaluations, and process evaluations of domestic terrorism and radicalization prevention programs. These, as the other studies, varied quite a bit in terms of their actual area of focus, in terms of their level of completion. And so in the end, what we decided to do is select 3 programs specifically, or 3 evaluations of 3 programs rather. These evaluations were focused on impact to a certain degree, process, and also focused on a specific similar program type. So trainings to prevent and increase awareness about radicalization and domestic terrorism. These 3 trainings were further disaggregated, and we chose these specifically because we wanted to add some type of comparative element in terms of the audience of the trainings. So we selected one evaluation of a training for law enforcement that was geared towards a law enforcement audience. This evaluation was conducted by the RAND Corporation and looked at the SLAT training specifically, so the state and local law enforcement anti-terrorism training that is operated under BJP. Yes. The second audience was a community audience, so we looked at an effort by the University of Chicago, of Illinois at Chicago, to evaluate the Safe Spaces community-led CVE program. This CVE program looked to utilize a kind of train-the-trainer element to increase awareness of and then community-led solutions to radicalization and violent extremism in their local contexts, and really promote community empowerment. And then we looked at an evaluation of a program that was focused on training youth. This was the Using Gatekeeper Training as a CVE tool, replication and evaluation of a gatekeeper program in Prince George's County by Answer Analytics Services. This project had built on a previously NIJ-funded project, actually an evaluation, to further test out some evaluation criteria, some metrics, and the applicability of these training programs in different contexts. So going into the findings, We came up with 5 key findings, many of them shared across these evaluation portfolios, which would be expected given the common training element, but also different in certain ways and unexpected because they had been geared to very different audiences. So we tried to synthesize similarities and commonalities based on the findings from these evaluations. The evaluations, of course, faced many challenges. All evaluations do. Evaluation is an imperfect science. In terrorism prevention specifically, we are constantly plagued with the need to prove a negative. So prove that because you participated in a program, you did not become a terrorist or engage in extremist behaviors and activities. That is very difficult to do, obviously. We also face specific challenges related to measuring how programs actually impacted behaviors and attitudes, not only in the short term, but in the long term. So attitudes are gauged somewhat easily by surveys. How do you feel about this group, for example? Do you feel strongly about this specific population based on their demographics, for example? But are subject to a lot of difficulties, again, because of biases, social desirability bias. Do you want to tell somebody who's giving you a survey how you really feel about something? Are you scared that they will actually take that negatively and think lesser of you? Do you not feel scared about that? Tell him honest things, please. We are leaving social desirability bias. Behaviors are a little bit trickier because how do you monitor a behavioral change? Do you put an ankle monitoring bracelet on somebody and measure how many times they met with the same person? Do you surveil them? Do you rely on them to actually tell you how they actually change their behavior towards a specific person, a specific agency, a specific X, Y, and Z? This is easy in programs, medical programs to a certain extent. For example, in smoking cessation programs, did you stop smoking? And is nicotine still in your bloodstream? Somewhat easy, right? Very, very difficult when we're talking about this in terms of social programs. And this goes beyond terrorism prevention. This goes to development programs and peace-building programs as well. So there are a lot of lessons to be shared there. But those are a couple challenges. Some recommendations that stem from that really focused on, again, long-term assessments. This is difficult because of funding cycles, obviously, but making sure you're following up at key points in times and using different methods that have been developed to better assess and changes in behaviors, changes in attitudes. Including test questions, too, is something that is recommended in terms of ensuring that you're actually getting the truth instead of something that's impacted, again, by that social desirability bias. But beyond the challenges and the lessons for evaluations moving forward, 5 key findings related to programs themselves emerged. So the first is that community-based terrorism prevention programs should be constructed and implemented in close consultation and coordination with intended beneficiaries. This seems like a no-brainer, but it is, again, very difficult and calls for a prolonged period of time and assessment prior to actually designing different programs. For law enforcement, many of the responses to the evaluation suggested that not all law enforcement officers actually needed the information that they were consuming. Not all law enforcement officers came in with the same level of background, so they had been taught the same material, but some of them already knew that material, so it wasn't necessarily helpful to them. So again, making sure the audience is embedded within it. For community programs, especially considering the national security kind of angle that terrorism prevention programs have, it can be very stigmatizing. Even in terrorism prevention programs that are not necessarily about terrorism prevention per se, but are about public health or violence reduction overall. In many cases, and the evaluation reference here, they had already had their own systems, their own social services, their own violence prevention, violence reduction programs going on. And the evaluation noted that by implementing this new terrorism prevention program, which again had a securitized angle to a certain extent, was actually duplicative, which is not necessarily helpful, especially when you add in that added element of securitization and potential stigmatization that can stem from it. 2, effective community-based terrorism prevention programs should employ rigorous and proactive collaborations. This again speaks to the importance of a long timeline, engagement with the community, and also assessment prior to developing different terrorism prevention programs, and ongoing assessment throughout. If you have a program that isn't useful to one community, why, and how do you shape it and kind of diverge it from the larger program to make sure it is relevant to one community, the other community, and embedding those cycles of evaluation, as annoying as it may be to, again, fill out a survey. Data is important. 3, the impact of terrorism prevention programs can go beyond terrorism prevention itself. This was a very interesting finding across each of the programs that we assessed. So the law enforcement focused, the youth focused, and the community-based focused programs. For each of them, the surveys and different methods that had been employed to evaluate the impact and attitudes towards the program pointed to the benefits that span beyond terrorism prevention. For youth specifically, they noted that some of the different techniques that they had been taught to prevent violent extremism or assess whether somebody was perhaps on a path towards radicalization had been used by the students and the youth who had participated in those programs, just not to address violent extremism or terrorism, but to address interpersonal conflict, and had been seen as very beneficial. The resume building and experience as well had been seen as very beneficial in the youth-focused programs. In law enforcement-focused programs, the importance of networking. So these programs brought people together from a broad array of cities, from organizations, from law enforcement offices that wouldn't necessarily interact with one another. And one of the most positive evaluation findings from that program specifically was the impact it had on not only encouraging individuals to interact with another, network, share information, but also provide opportunities to explore different avenues for career progression. Finally, the evaluation focused on the community program also noted that it had kind of enabled different communities, or this specific community, I should say, to come up with their own solutions to violent extremism, assess their own means of addressing it, although issues associated with long-term resourcing kind of got in the way of that as well. But while these are different corollary goals, it is still important to note that these different types of programs, while perhaps not having a direct impact on terrorism itself, do have impacts that span far beyond that. 4, this one's very important. So including terrorism prevention and broader violence prevention and public health programming can be more successful than standalone terrorism prevention programs. However, at the same time, and this is highly informed from both the youth and the community evaluations of programs, this can actually have a negative impact in terms of confusing participants to the actual point of the program. If you're embedding terrorism prevention and public health and community resilience programs, how are you doing that? Again, we have a securitized and a non-securitized type of angle that are working together. How do you define terrorism? Are you actually using the term terrorism? And if you're not using the term terrorism, which was a component of this project, then how are you actually reaching your terrorist prevention goals or measuring, how it's actually functioning in the real world and its impact? Still, using public health programs was seen as a more acceptable means of actually implementing some of these programs. Individuals and communities were more open to public health prevention frameworks rather than terrorism prevention goals, which they saw as stigmatizing and potentially profiling their communities as national security threats. So something to consider moving forward. And then finally, understanding the efficacy, suitability, and impact of community-based terrorism prevention programs is key to achieving policy priorities and serving community needs. This kind of goes without saying, but evaluations are very important. They're also very expensive. I think we all recognize that. They take a lot of effort, they take a lot of time, they take a lot of creativity, and they take a lot of reassessment. You need to have long-term follow-up to actually understand long-term outcomes and impacts. Continuing to invest in these types of programs, evaluations of programs, is really essential to figuring out whether they're working and how we actually need to change them, and resource saving in the long term. I will pause before I go on to the last synthesis effort. Evaluation-related questions, or questions about the survey. I don't know that much about it. Great, okay. Let's go on to the last one. This was, I think, my favorite project. I am biased, I will admit. But for our last synthesis effort, reviewing not only NIJ-sponsored research from the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Portfolio, but also NIJ-sponsored research from the portfolio on mass shootings and portfolio on bias and hate crimes. My co-author Thomas and I explored the extent to which these different types of crimes are related, differ, compared to one another. Specifically, we didn't, because of the information available, we didn't actually look at the types of crimes and the how they were actually implemented in different settings, but we did look at the profiles of individuals who had been convicted of committing these crimes based on all of this different research to examine the extent to which there were overlaps in sociodemographic factors between them. A little bit on framing, of course, and then a little bit on data. The overlap, I mean, all of these different things are very closely intertwined, but they're also very distinct, and I think that's something important. It's very difficult to, again, define, especially when an event occurs, whether or not it falls within some of these different categories, especially when it seems to fall in multiple categories. But that definition is very important, especially when we're throwing around terms like violent extremism. So to embark on this endeavor, we started by framing how these different similar types of violent crimes do actually intersect. Violent extremism obviously has no universally accepted definition. The UN doesn't even have a definition that's necessarily representative of all of its different member states. But one thing that does unite different definitions that are kicking around in this space is that violent extremism involves the support for, association with, or participation in violent activities to achieve an ideological goal. The ideological goal, which is the most important component there. That is the unifier of all of these different definitions of violent extremism. Mass shootings vary in terms of their definitions, so you'll get a different definition based on law enforcement agency, based on researcher. We've defined it here based on the FBI's definition as an event wherein 3 or more victims are murdered by firearms. Some definitions say 4 or more. Some include casualties rather than just fatalities. Some don't. So we'll get to this a little bit later, but it makes comparing data and understanding these different types of offenses a little bit difficult when the definitions are so varied. And finally, hate and bias crimes are criminal offenses motivated by bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. The definition of hate and bias crimes can also vary. So again, we're kind of working in an amorphous space. But based on these 3 definitions, there are obvious overlaps. So you can see a situation in which you had a violent extremist attack motivated by a hateful or biased ideology that also involved a firearm wherein 3 or more victims are murdered by firearms. So the overlap there, as you can see, denoted by the letter D in the middle. You can also imagine situations in which violent extremism and hate and bias crimes intersected, but they didn't involve a firearm, so they can't be categorized as a mass shooting. Or they did involve a firearm, but they didn't involve the fatality of 3 or more victims. So this is kind of just scoping out the space and the differences and overlaps between them before moving into some of the findings from the comparison. So again, I will caveat this with the fact that as we looked at these different projects, the University of Maryland's PIRUS dataset, which is a great resource, profiles on individuals radicalized in the United States, highly recommend checking that out. To look through violent extremist views and behaviors, the Violence Project, which specifically focused on mass shootings, and then the bias data set also by the University of Maryland, which is comparable to the PIRUS data set to a certain degree because it is using the same type of indicators, and the NHCEIS data sets, both of which focused on hate and bias crimes. So we looked across these different data sets. Here we have a listing and a comparison in this matrix of the differences between their methods. So some used open source searches, others used surveys given out to law enforcement officers, and others used existing lists that they had access to. There's some overlap, of course, between the PIRUS dataset and the bias dataset because they used the same type of data to populate each where it was actually feasible and appropriate to do so. We also listed various levels of access and differences in terms of the size of the sheer data that's in there, with PIRUS obviously having the most profiles and data available at just over 2,200. Whereas the Violence Project had released at 172. So this gives you a span of how different each of this data is. I'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of how different it is from a coding perspective. So did they include the same information on gender breakdowns? Did they include the same information on social networks, on romantic relationships, and how did they include that information? All of this speaks to the need for more comparable studies across these different types of similar but again distinct offenses. And at the bottom there, you'll see that there's also a difference in terms of time span. So with the Violence Project having been most recently updated as of last year, but spanning a shorter time period perhaps than the PIRUS dataset. And the NHCIS dataset specifically only spanning 1 year. So all of these, again, comparability, caveats associated with that. The comparability is limited, but we were able to kind of, again, piece together a puzzle, extrapolate some synthesized findings that point us in the direction for future research and policy understanding. So among the key findings, and I'll go into this a little bit on the next page as well, was that across these 3 different offender types, there were a lot of similarities in terms of age, sex, gender, employment, and criminal histories, with the majority of offenders being white male offenders in their 20s and 30s with who were unemployed at the time of the offense and who had had some type of violent or nonviolent criminal history. Obviously, this describes a broad swath of the population, so it's not necessarily a very reliable matrix to understand whether or not this is a risk, this constitutes a risk factor. But it was very interesting to see, again, across this broad swath of information that these similarities seem to appear over and over and over again. Still, despite these similarities, risk factors varied across each offense type and importantly within each offense type. So the PIRUS dataset specifically not only looks at violent extremist offenses and profiles of radicalization, it also disaggregates that based on a variety of different factors, including ideological motivation. Far left, far right, religiously motivated, and jihadist. I said that right. In addition, the bias dataset, also by the University of Maryland, further disaggregates hate crimes and bias crimes based on not necessarily ideological motivation, but the focus of that hate or bias. So was it focused on religion, or religious orientation, sexual orientation, race, etc.? So within these different types of crimes, there was just as much variation as across these different types of crimes. So I'll go into the next page briefly to kind of discuss some of that variation in more depth. but again, speaks to the fact that this is a highly complex and individualized kind of process. It's a very highly contextualized process, and even among different specific offender types, there's an incredible amount of variation. There's also a lot of similarities between very specific offender types across the spectrum as well. So we'll get into that in the next page. Finding 3, we've touched on this a little bit, but assessing risk because of all of that variation is a challenge, and because of the shared characteristics being enormously broad. If we profiled all white men who were unemployed, had a criminal history, and were from 20 to 30 years old, you would get a large swath of the population that is by no means representative, again, of risk or propensity. So based on that, risk mitigation and prevention strategies must be very carefully crafted and tailored to the offense type and the individual. And that, I know, always seems like a cop-out, but given the vast variation within a lot of these different offense types and profiles, I'll go into that again in the next page, that careful crafting and tailoring is immensely important. And finally, I discussed this a little bit before, but data limitations may impact our understanding. A lot of this data is derived from open source reporting, which means media reporting, which is notoriously incomplete and can be based on potentially false information, which limits our ability to understand the phenomenon correctly. And reporting also varies from district to district, from agency to agency, from research organization to research organization, which makes it difficult to understand the data that we're dealing with and the reality of the situations in which we're making assessments. So I've included a select cross comparison here based on the 3 different types of offenses. These give you a little bit of an idea of the similarities and differences between these different types of offenses, and based on the broader kind of like population ratios. So as mentioned, all violent extremists, across violent extremists, male or mass shooting, bias and hate crimes offenders, males, 20s to 30s, typically unemployed at the time of event, with a criminal history, and an added factor in that is that they were typically unmarried. That's not to say that they didn't have a romantic relationship, it just is to say that they weren't actually engaged in a civil union or wedded to one another. There are very differences in that as well. And then in terms of differences across offense types, and based on, again, the general population, violent extremists tended to they had varied education levels based on ideology, but they tended to have a higher education level than mass shooters and bias and hate crime offenders. Again, this comparison is very imperfect based on the data available, so take that with a grain of salt, but it does give us a little breadcrumb to follow moving forward. Within violent extremist offenders, far right offenders tended to be the least educated, far left offenders tended to be the most educated, with the other types of offenders kind of varied between the two. In terms of trauma was a really interesting thing. So some data sets did not code for previous trauma, and previous trauma is, again, a very subjective term, very difficult to assess. But for mass shooting offenders in particular, and across the databases on mass shooting offenses, trauma was seen to be a very significant factor, especially among individuals who had conducted K through 12 shootings, experiencing an inordinately high level of early childhood trauma. Something to consider. Bias and hate crimes also coded for trauma, but that tend to be varied based on motivation and also a little bit lower. But among mass shooters, trauma seemed to be a highly prevalent and kind of persistent threat, again, especially among K through 12 individuals who engaged in K through 12 shootings. Mental health histories. So again, this varies based on definition and data available, and individual histories of using different types of medications or seeking counseling for mental health issues. Among those, mass shooting Individuals who had carried out mass shooting offenses tended to have a much higher rate of known mental health histories than did individuals who had engaged in offenses related to violent extremism and bias and hate crimes. Military history, again, varied. Violent extremist offenders didn't necessarily have a uniform kind of record of military history, with those who were coded as having far-right ideologies displaying the highest amount within that category of military history. Mass shooting offenders, something that was very interesting, tended to have a higher history of engagement in the military. This was very interesting because if you look at the overall data for mass shooting offenders, they tend towards the younger ages, so having a higher history of military engagement, especially amongst like the smaller proportion that were of a higher age, was particularly interesting and something that was brought out within the research findings. And then bias and hate crimes tended to have a lower amount of military history. That also did vary to a certain extent, depending on the motivation, but in general appeared to be lower than other types of offenses. Thank you. And then finally, going back to this discussion about social networks, group affiliations tended to vary based on the different types of offenses, with violent extremists reported to have a higher level, I guess, a higher number of higher reporting of group affiliations. So this is affiliations to dyads, triads, dyads being 2 or more people, triads being 3 or more people, small cell and larger group affiliations to violent extremist-oriented individuals and organizations. Mass shootings, as you can imagine, tended not to have group affiliations. Individuals who had committed mass shooting offenses tended to be a little bit more socially isolated, especially as compared to individuals who had contributed to or participated in violent extremist offenses. And then finally, individuals who had participated in bias or hate crimes also tended to have group affiliations, although that did vary again based on their motivation. It also varied in terms of types of attacks, but I will give you more information from the actual study before I get into that. Any questions before I wrap this up quickly? And then take more questions. Okay. Yes.
For your military, on that one, why is that one caveat with the asterisk? Is there more data combined from or about from military backgrounds?
The asterisk. Sorry, let me check this very quickly, lest I give you the wrong information. Now it is missing. Let me get back to you on that one. I'm wondering if it's a typo at this point, but let me get back to you on that one.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this probably leads into your next slide, but the definition of violent extremism seems very closely tied to that of terrorism, and the only word that's different, I think, is ideological and political. Has violent extremism kind of swallowed terrorism as a concept in their academic field, or by DOJ and their policies?
I'll let Aisha respond to that from DOJ and the policies. From the academic field, it's so technically there are differences between the two, right? Violent extremism being the ideological portion and terrorism being an outcome of violent extremism, right? A terrorist act as something that can come from violent extremism but doesn't necessarily come from violent extremism. Thinking in like Venn diagrams here, right? There has been a tendency, in my own personal opinion, over the past decade to equate the two a little bit too much. So there has been mission creep between the two, where violent extremism became a popular term and then was used in reference to otherwise acts of terrorism or terrorist activities. They are very closely related. but the distinction between them, the ideological versus the politically motivated factor, added to that from like a political science perspective, terrorism being an act that is meant to inspire fear or instill fear within a broader population, whereas violent extremism can be a little bit more insular and not necessarily geared towards achieving that end in a political fashion. These are some differences, but there is a lot of blurring between the two. Some research brings it out a little bit more, and other just kind of coalesces it all together. So it kind of depends. But I will let Aisha respond based on NIJ's work.
We do. So in our solicitation, we have like a definition section, and I think it's just that, like Kat already touched on it. It's sort of the act versus support for. So you can be a violent extremist. You can think that it is okay to achieve a certain outcome through violence based on a particular thought or ideology that you have. And you can support that, you can think that it's okay, and but that doesn't make you a terrorist. So I think it's that sort of next transition of like at the actual act is what sort of makes that different. But this is like the most talked about, and like there is no consensus on this. Everybody, every agency, every research organization has a different definition of this, and it's just like. This is like our age-old unnecessary debate.
Yeah. Well, we criminalize material support to terrorism, but can you criminalize material support to violent extremism? I guess is the question that's asked.
Right. And then but even with material support charges, right? It's like it's for international, like foreign terrorist organizations. So like, how do we deal with that, like at home? When we have like issues like that going on. So there's also that whole debate.
I'm going to mention this, and I'm going to regret mentioning this, because this has been like the past 8 to 10 years of my life. But even beyond the distinction between terrorism and violent extremism, you get into further debates about, do you call it violent extremism or do you call it extremist violence? Is it the violence or is it the extremism? How do you define extremism? Is it just like, vis-a-vis all of these terms? So there's a lot more underneath the surface that bubbles up beneath it. I think the importance, again, is the criminality of it, as opposed to just holding the ideology, so support for actual acts of violence and criminality, which violent extremism doesn't always encompass, so it gets confusing. Any other questions?
So, just on that, so the violent extremism incorporates non-domestic people?
So it's, for NIJ, I'll let Aisha respond. It's used in the international context as well, and again with the same definitional issues. So we'll label Al-Shabaab, for example, is a violent extremist group and a terrorist group. People will label it differently, but it is a designated terrorist organization, so that kind of makes it easier. When you get into non-designated organizations, the usage of the term can also be a little bit fluid and a little bit less rigorous, which is difficult to deal with. Yeah, so it's difficult. But Aisha, if you...
No, I didn't have anything.
I'm sorry, I have a question about just the blurring of the definitions between violent extremists and counterterror. So, is there an artificial barrier then in terms of resourcing and funding based on how you classify something? For instance, U.S. federal agencies often will have a counterterror task force or division or something within a larger federal agency. Is there anything like that for violent extremist organizations? And if not, does that limit the amount of resources or force you can bring to bear on the federal or state level against something that isn't counter-terror, it's counter-violent extremism?
I am not equipped to answer that question, but I think it's a very good question, especially from a funding perspective and a coordination perspective. I would not be able to answer that question, unfortunately, though. So, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right, so we'll wrap up really quickly. Again, in the interest of time, I've skimmed over a lot of information. I'm happy to talk more about this information later. We're hoping to have the fact sheets published soon as well, so would be very eager to share those with you once they're out. We'll share them once they're out. But I wanted to end on a discussion of the overall findings across these different, related again, but different areas of focus in terms of the broader portfolio of NIJ-sponsored research on domestic radicalization. So the first is kind of what we were just talking about. Definitions of violent extremism and other offense types matter, but they vary, and this does have very real implications for research, policy, and practice. One of the most important implications, and one of the things that I hone in on a lot, because my work is mostly geared towards translating research for policy and practice, is that researcher definitions can vary substantially from actual political definitions. And not knowing those definitions, and again, that's why we have a lot of caveats here, because these definitions also varied, can have very drastic complications, impacts on the work that we do in the policy and practice side. So again, over-equating political ideology with violent extremist or violent ideology based on a definition that's not necessarily agreed upon can have very bad consequences. So definitions really matter. What definitions are varies a lot. So understanding the actual definition that's being used in each case, even though there's no one-size-fits-all definition, again, gives us a very different perspective and view of the data that we're consuming. Similarly to that, there's no one-size-fits-all profile of radicalization processes or of individuals who radicalize to violence. Again, complexity. A lot of this across each of the studies pointed to the fact that it's not just an idea, it's not just a persuasion, it's not just social networks, it's not just online activities, it's actual lived experiences, it's backgrounds of individuals and how they perceive the world and their options within it based on those individual experiences. I know this doesn't make anybody's job any easier, but it does speak to the importance of understanding that, well, you know, efforts to create different profiles are useful. Again, if we assume that anybody who is a white male, unemployed at the time, and has a history of, between their 20s and 30s is in any way more likely to commit active violence, it's not really a precise science, not necessarily something that will give us the results that we want to see. 3 is that social networks can play a role in radicalization processes, including through leakage. Now, I meant to discuss leakage a little bit. I went a little bit too quickly through these slides, but leakage is in reference to when an individual intentionally or unintentionally divulges their plans to commit an act of violence or to radicalize. Across all of these studies, and I'll touch on this here and then show you a slide a little bit later, leakage was a very prominent factor in terms of not only mass shooting events, participation in violent extremist organizations, but also in terms of social networks' ability to understand, you know, again, from a very close perspective, whether an individual is plotting to participate in a violent extremist event or is kind of on a pathway to radicalization. Leakage is very important. And given the issues associated with not being able to adopt a one-size-fits-all profile or not being able to kind of pinpoint definitions and issues associated with understanding and making sense of complexity, leakage provides us with a very real prevention opportunity, but one that, as Aisha mentioned before and is within these research projects, can be very fraught. Particularly because of issues of lack of trust, fear of consequences, fear of losing a relationship between you and a loved one or a friend who might be plotting or planning something, or you might see as pursuing a path to radicalization to violence, but you're too scared because of, again, fear of law enforcement, or fear of losing a friendship or losing a friend or getting something wrong, which speaks again to the importance of community engagement and ensuring that the mechanisms for reporting on suspected, again, pursuits of terrorism, I guess we should say at this point, are varied but also accessible and anonymized when necessary. So a lot of this is in some of the reports, but because we are running out of time, I will run through this really quickly. Challenges and limitations to data impacted all of the findings across these synthesis reports, and that is because data is very hard to get, very hard to assess, and definitions do vary. And finally, risk does not always equate with propensity. I've said that a lot today, but it can serve as an important area of awareness-based efforts, particularly in the online space, and particularly in an effort to preserve and not infringe on individual civic liberties and freedoms. So that's the wrong one. In terms of implications for policies and practice, understanding stigmatization, so this comes from profiling, and adopting a holistic lens to addressing violence is an area that popped up throughout the synthesis of these different studies. Gaining community buy-in, tailoring programs, and addressing community concerns, which takes a concerted effort and a longer timeline in terms of community engagement. Focusing on behaviors and behavioral motivations rather than just focusing on ideological factors. This gets back to the violent extremism versus terrorism discussion. But holding an extremist idea is not what we're looking at here. It's the actual support for engagement in violent activity that is problematic. Understanding gray areas, so these are complex interactions between individuals, social and environmental factors, which underlines the importance of understanding complexity in this sphere. Addressing leakage by improving reporting mechanisms, and also improving reporting mechanisms in terms of shared data on different types of violent crimes. And then, most importantly, I think understanding and deconflicting terrorism prevention's overlap with other social programs and policies. Preventing and countering violent extremism as a field in particular has adopted a lot of, borrowed from a lot of different fields related to public health, peace building, community policing, et cetera, without really having a clear guideline for when that does become a national security priority versus just a community resilience kind of initiative. That type of blurring can lead to, again, the first point, the stigmatization of different communities, the perceived stigmatization of different communities, which can have adverse consequences, especially when it's seen as impeding or does impede on individual liberties. This is something that came across very strongly throughout the research, and something that I think we're still grappling with today, but deserves more recognition in the field. I'm going to end there because I talked about leakage a little bit already, and I know that I'm probably over time. Am I over time? I'm over time. Sorry. So we couldn't get to all of the in-depth kind of findings from each of these. Again, the reports are much more in-depth and provide much richer analysis and information. So looking forward to sharing those with you guys soon. Any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me through Vic and Aisha. And thank you again for your time. I'm going to go rest my voice now. So thank you.